One of the most important things you must do for the OCR A-Level Law is memorize the content. This may sound obvious, but loads of people don't know how to memorize or what the most effective way to memorize is, or they can't push themselves to memorize. Now, the exam papers are really a test of memorization rather than understanding. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you don't need to understand the course. I'm saying yes, you do need to understand it, but the exam mostly tests your memorization. So you have to pick up the OCR A-Level Law book, A-Level Law textbook, and memorize pretty much everything in it. You got loads of cases to memorize, acts, statutes, and other details about the legal system. And a lot of this information you're probably are going to forget anyways. But the best way to memorize the content is to break it down like I have into memorizable chunks, so you can get a top-down view and an overall picture of law. This approach will allow you to get an overall picture of where each piece of the puzzle fits in to the larger picture, law. This is how I've broken it down into main points, in which after you've memorized each of the main points, you add more detail in. So when you memorize these 6 main points: parliamentary legislation, delegated legislation, statutory interpretation, judicial precedents, law reform, EU law. When you memorized these 6 points and the main subheadings that occur underneath each of these, once you've memorized them, you add more detail in. Let's look at how I've broken it down. Essentially, what I've done is I've broken it down according to the textbook and the curriculum. They're the 2 main sources you want to be looking at when memorizing and getting an overview of the content you need to memorize. You go directly to the source, you look at the curriculum and see what OCR themselves or whatever exam board themselves are telling you to memorize, what you need to know and what's going to be in the exam paper. And the second way is looking through the textbook, and the textbook will provide a lot more detail than the overall specification that OCR gives, that the exam board gives. So first, what I do is I'd look at the exam board, see what they've told you. Once you've memorized what they've pretty much told you, then you look to the textbook and add in more detail to fleshing out your understanding and really just allow you to memorize as much as possible so you can get those AO1 marks and AO2 marks, because as I've said before, AO2 is pretty much built off AO1. So this is how I've broken it down for myself to memorize. So I've memorized each point under parliamentary legislation. I've added in more detail to make sure I memorize that, and then each time I revise over it, so let's say once a week or twice a week, I revise over all of this information. So the first time I revise it, the second time I test myself to see if I've got it all in my head, and if I have, I add more to it. So when I started off, the first thing I did was checked to see if I know everything that came under lawmaking. So I checked to make sure if I knew these top 6, I knew all of that. I went into more detail and I added the main points under parliamentary legislation, which was the law process and pros and cons of the legislative process. After I memorized that, I also added the same amount of details under delegated legislation and statutory interpretation and the rest of them. So types of delegated legislation, controls on delegated legislation, effectiveness of controls, pros and cons, and then under statutory interpretation, rules, purpose of approach, intrinsic and extrinsic aid, impact of EU law on statutory interpretation. So I'm sure you get the idea. So that's what I've done. Now, writing it down, for me personally, that also helps me to memorize. So first, when I'm writing it down, it helps me to memorize. Then when I read it over, it helps consolidate what I've written down. And then when I go over it the third time and test myself, that really just cements it in my brain, and I pretty much can't forget it after that anytime soon. And then to this, you just add the important details that always reoccur and that you have to write in the exam. So when you do a lot of past papers, you see what reoccurs a lot and you memorize a lot of those main points. You don't need to memorize into crazy detail until you've got all of these main points. And this will make sure you have a widespread knowledge, not just knowledge in some particular areas of law. You'll have a more broader knowledge. So do this for all of the topics that you've covered for law, and hopefully that should help you to memorize the content for law. See you in the next video.